delighted to be in the chair for session 2, which is entitled Climate Change Impact, Geography and Politics. We will certainly be covering a vast amount of geography and a lot of politics to boot. In the next 75 minutes, we'll hear from 4 speakers who, again, are deep experts in their fields. The speakers have been asked in turn to cover key insights from their research in a maximum of 10 to 15 minutes, which is, no small ask. And after all the presenters have presented, we'll have the opportunity to ask some questions. And please do put your questions in the Q&A function. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. Dr. Tim Benton leads the Energy, Environment and Resources Programme at Chatham House. From 2011 to 2016, he was the champion of the UK's Global Food Security Programme. He's worked with successive UK governments, the EU and the G20, and has been a global agenda steward of the World Economic Forum. He was an author of the IPCC's 2019 Special Report on Food, Land and Climate and the UK's Climate Risk Assessment. His presentation concerns cascading and systemic environmental risks. Tim, thank you. I can see your screen is there. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tim. Very nice introduction. And I'm aiming to build on some of the comments that have been made beforehand. And in a sense, it's a segue between the last session and thinking geographically. And I could reframe this really as a story about falling dominoes as per the picture here, because that's what I really want to talk about. It's the way that risks can arise from compounding hazards coupled with environmental, socioeconomic situations. So if I can work this. So our normal way of thinking about risk is articulated by the standard risk equation, that the risk is some function of a hazard, exposure and vulnerability. And the way we've thought about it largely in the climate area is about the direct risks. If there's extreme rainfall, the hazard, will you get flooded? So are you at the top or bottom of a hill? Are you exposed? And are you vulnerable? Have you got flood defenses? But of course, in the complex world in which we live, this is so much a cartoon and such an underestimate of the total risk architecture that what I really want to do is build on this and put some kind of slightly greater layers of complexity behind it. So starting off with the kind of hazards component, what are the hazards? And we've talked about them a little bit. First of all, there's climate change, the change in the average weather over a 30-year period. And we know that that's going to gradually warm or gradually dry or gradually whatever. And as John, I think it was earlier said, we can adapt to that. We can understand it. Then there's the issue about the changing weather, particularly the extremes. And part of the issue that we face is that our climate models are not particularly good at estimating the extremes. And of course, rare events are much more difficult from a probabilistic case to be able to estimate. Then the next thing is tipping points in climate change. Joe, in the last session, mentioned what happens if we have a tipping point in the ice sheet melt and the speed with which the sea level could rise. We've also got potential tipping points, for example, in the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation that drives the Gulf Stream. And you can imagine if the Gulf Stream switches off, how much that would reconfigure global patterns of climate in ways that are not predicted by the models. And then the fourth area, which is totally underestimated, land use change is the other big environmental driver. The fourth area that is totally underestimated is the ecological impact of climate change and how much that might drive the sorts of risks that we're concerned with. There are many ways that land use change coupled with climate change reconfigure ecosystems, and the end result is that ecosystems are typically unstable and lead to the outbreaks of pests and diseases and so on. And COVID might be a prime example of the sorts of threats that might come from climate change on biodiversity. And one other big thing before we move on, when I started working on climate change about 20 years ago, I was told by somebody in DEFRA, my background area is food security, oh, you don't have to worry about food security and climate, because if it's a bad year for for one place, it'll be a good year in other places, and therefore trade will balance everything out. And what we're increasingly recognizing is that the global weather is crucially interconnected, and particularly in the press has been the waviness of the jet stream, leading to the impact where you have, if the jet stream waves down, it sucks cold, wet air from the north. If it waves up, it sucks hot, dry air from the south. So what happens in a year of wavy jet stream like this year is that you have alternating areas of flood and extreme heat all around the northern hemisphere. And what we've seen is we've had heat in different places and we've had floods in different places. But of course, when you have globally bad weather, globally extreme weather, it leads much more to the chances of compounding impacts, such as multiple breadbasket failure. So going back to this risk equation, where are we? Well, with respect to hazards, we've got a good understanding of the climate change slow onset hazards. We're getting a better understanding of how extreme weather is going to change, but that's still pretty dire in many situations. We don't have a good understanding of the teleconnections between extreme weather in different places. We have a very poor predictive understanding of tipping points, and we have no predictive understanding of climate change impacts on ecology and what that might do to hazards. So everything we do about thinking about the risks of climate change, I think, is incredibly conservative to the way that these things might connect to each other. So just briefly, we've talked about sea level rise a few times. Of course, flood risk is only partly influenced by sea level rise. It's influenced by extreme weather in the sense of rainfall. So most ports are beside rivers. So if you get a rainfall flood, that compounds it. It's influenced by storms, and storms influence sea level. The lower the depression, the more the sea level gets sucked up. And in a center of tropical cyclone, that could give a meter of sea level rise. And of course, the storms, as they get windier, give a bigger storm surge. So the actual issue to do with port infrastructure and critical infrastructure is not necessarily just sea level rise. It's the way all of these things interact together. Then regarding the exposure element, no, sorry. My mouse is not working for some reason. So the thing I really want to emphasize today about these interactions is to move away from thinking about the direct hazards. So how will climate change our flood risk or our sea level rise or whatever, to thinking not just about impact chains, a flood leading to a power cut, leading to people lighting their houses with candles, leading to house fires or whatever it might be, but really to start thinking about the way that a hazard leads to multiple impacts simultaneously, which can lead to a whole range of things that cross geographies and cross sectors, leading potentially to a whole range of things that create systemic failure. And this is the part of the climate change risk architecture that we have not really built into the way we are thinking in any meaningful sense. So to go back to this equation, exposure to the climate risks is not whether or not you're going to get flooded. That's part of it, of course, but it's how much does your national, institutional, financial, national security depend on, for example, goods from overseas, or the flow of finance, or the flow of information, or the flow of people. And your vulnerability is not whether or not you've got flood defenses and the direct impacts, but it's a whole range of things about how much do your supply chains depend on goods coming from overseas. And we talked a little bit about it in the earlier talks. But for example, our just-in-time supply chains, the way we build our economies, are incredibly fragile to disruptions, as we in the UK have been finding recently, with Christmas getting cancelled because no one's planning to deliver turkeys, partly because gas prices have gone up and we're not manufacturing fertilizer anymore, and we can't therefore get the CO2 to stun the turkeys. So all of that is an example of how the interconnectedness of our supply chains are driving things in a difficult direction and are actually fragile. And of course, as somebody else mentioned earlier, it's not just about these exposure and vulnerabilities and the hazards, it's also about the perception, as we found with the panic buying of fuel in the UK, it's about the perception of the risk that determines responses just as much as the risk itself. So this is a cartoon from the UK's Climate Change Risk Assessment International Risks chapter, just to try and illustrate some of these transmission pathways by which risks can be compounded and move across geographies and sectors. So we've got climate change over this side of the screen. Climate can have a direct impact on a focal country like the UK, but it can get mediated through the flow of energy, the flow of finance markets, governance issues. We've talked a little bit about conflict, IT and information architecture. An undersea cable was recently taken out by a marine landslide that was caused by extreme rainfall in a river nearby and led to data loss in South Africa. Movement of goods clearly is very fragile, and if we block, for example, the traffic flow through the Nile, the canal, then obviously that has to leads to huge impacts that kind of cascade across sectors. Movement of people we've talked a little about, and so on. So there are kind of feedback loops all over the place, but the issue is that the climate risk that we face as a UK from a human security and even a national security is not directly related to where the hazard is going to fall, and therefore it becomes relatively difficult to predict. So just putting this in slightly different words, here we have the climate impacts up here. Those climate impacts, of which there are a great range, can affect trade, stability, conflict, finance, etc. And they can all lead to cascading impacts to any country of concern. And managing those impacts is, of course, a cross-government issue, which creates problems in itself because of the siloed nature of government. The interruption of food is not just caused by an interruption of agriculture in the UK. And just as an example of the sorts of risk cascades that I'm talking about, this is 2010 11 food price spike. That was sparked by the Eastern European heat wave, led to a decline in cereal yields in Russia, export ban out of Russia for their national security, panic on the global market. More panic led to more governments putting in place export bans. That led to commodity price rises. That led to problems both in the UK, but food-related riots in many less stable jurisdictions. And all in turn, that sparked the Arab Spring, led to the geopolitical configuration of the Middle East, change in flow of migration into Europe, rise of nationalism in Europe, and you can even say that there's probably a causal pathway to Brexit. So this is a kind of 10-year risk cascade that comes from climate change. And what we're underestimating in our thinking is the frequency and severity of these sorts of things happening all of the time. And it goes without saying that these risk cascades, because they can be absolutely enormous in their impact, are going to be typically orders of magnitude greater impact and cost than the hazard itself. So just where are we this year? Here has been a range of things that we have noticed coming from climate: heat domes, wind helping to block the Suez Canal, rising pests and diseases, COVID, and locusts in different parts of the world. We know hazards are increasing. We know our exposure is increasing because of the increasing global interconnectedness of the economy and the risks. And we know that our vulnerability is increasing, whichever way you look at it, whether it's the international multilateral architecture or whether it is our lean economies, whether it is the kind of current zeitgeist about geopolitics and so on. So just a final word. How do we think about these things into the future? Well, our risk architecture, our risk management has often been based on thinking about black swans. Now, if I, as a food person, think about the sorts of black swan events that could interrupt food and global food supply and causing local food insecurity, I can think of thousands of them. Drought, flood, blockages of the Suez Canal or ports, disruption of processing facilities, human diseases, plant diseases, animal diseases, etc., etc. And if you think about each one of these being a potential black swan event, but there are about 1,000 ways that our global food system could be pushed into a food price spike, then effectively you're in the situation where you can't predict what's going to happen, but you can bloody well predict that something will happen in any arbitrary time period. So I think the big thing I would say is that we've really got to start thinking about not trying to directly predict the hazard that's going to be of most concern, although of course we should, but building much more a world that is able to cope with turbulence, uncertain, novelty, and ambiguity in decision-making, the tunerness of the world, turbulence, very fast-moving, uncertain, unpredictable, novel, things that will be thrown at us that we don't know about and haven't experienced, and ambiguous, that there's no right thing to do in any one circumstances. So just to, I'll skip that slide because Tim's looking worried. So the world is increasingly tuner. We know shocks are going to increase. Risk cascades are likely to becoming much more common, leading to systemic risks. That's the way that climate change can be a risk multiplier. They might not just be extreme events, but can be ecological, and they're going to be a real bugger to deal with in terms of the magnitude and the ripple of the impacts. And just in case anybody is interested, on the Chatham House website, we published last week a recent climate change risk assessment in accessible form that just highlights some of these things in order to be able to, for people to accessibly read it rather than the 1,300 pages of the IPCC. All right, I'll stop there. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you very much, Tim. And great to think about food security in terms of black swans and tuners. Wonderful. Lots of significant food for thought there. What we'll do now is we'll turn to our second speaker in the session. You've taken down your slides. If Dave Anderson could load his slides up, share his screen. As I introduce him, Dave Anderson is Professor of African History at the University of Warwick. He's also affiliated to the Universities of Cologne and Stellenbosch. David has long-standing interests in security and conservation in lots of parts of Eastern Africa, and linked to an ongoing research project. Dave is speaking to us today on water scarcity and violence in East Africa, micro conflicts and climate change. Thank you.
Tim, thank you very much indeed. This paper, I suppose, shifts us from overview to ground sourcing and ground truthing, with a paper that looks at research that's actually been trying to identify where violence and micro conflicts are emerging that are linked to climate change. The project has been funded as part of the Global Challenges Research Fund here in the UK through the British Academy. And we've been working quite closely with a number of colleagues in Kenya who've participated very energetically in the field research we've done. We've also been collaborating, I think it's very important to make this point, we've been collaborating with the National Centre for Research on Crime in Kenya, which is a kind of think tank, I suppose it's best described as, that's linked to the Kenyan Police and National Intelligence Office. And we are supplying them with our results in the hope that this may have some kind of policy impact in Kenya. So our research looks at the increases in micro conflicts that are linked in Kenya to water scarcity. Now, we know these are happening because we have been able to monitor in the last 5 years a growing number of incidents across the country, but predominantly in semi-arid, low-lying areas of the country of reported problems. Now, the causes of these are complex and variant. They are not all linked to climate change, but climate change plays a role that is very significant, whether it's causal or not. So let me explain that to begin with. The climate change impacts on this story in three quite important ways. Firstly, perception of climate change as cause is manifest and pervasive. In East Africa these days, almost everything is blamed on climate change. It's become part of a rhetoric that in a way is useful politically. And it's useful politically because in many circumstances, it gives Kenya's politicians a free pass. If the cause of something is climate change, what could they possibly do about it? It's beyond their control. It's above their pay grade. Therefore, the climate change excuse, as we term it, is being deployed again and again by hapless politicians who therefore claim there's nothing they could possibly do about it. And thirdly, the escalation of conflict among local people is driven by anxiety of climate change. A discourse has developed in many rural areas that says, well, if climate change is true and it's happening, we'd better seize what we can now before some other bugger takes it. In other words, it's led to a fomenting and a gathering and accumulation of what we would call exclusionary politics. Get that resource now and control it, because if you don't, it could be a hell of a lot worse in 10 years' time. Now, that argument has led, we would argue, to lots of people escalating conflicts into violence much more rapidly than they would have done in the past. Okay, so with those thoughts in mind, let's move through our slides here to illustrate what the project's done. So firstly, just slides that illustrate where we've been working. Those of you who know Kenya, Isiolo County in the center of Kenya, semi-arid area, very prone to conflict. Here, this image shows the Western Nile River at Gotu. This is typical of a river watering point. This watering point has been subject to numerous armed conflicts over access to the water and the order in which herds can access the water. Here, an ancient well in Marsabit County, our second field site, Marsabit, a vast county in northern Kenya. Again, very high levels of conflict generally, but the wells have recently become the focal point of conflict as different ethnic groups and different communities seek to control their access to particular wells. Now, traditional systems, culturally embedded practices govern these processes, but these are now being challenged. And sometimes government legislation, which is not intended for this purpose, is being used to subvert existing traditional structures of control and management. And conflict around wells is becoming increasingly common in Marsabit and has led to violence only in the past 2 weeks. Thirdly, we worked in Narok County on Kenya's southern border with Tanzania. And here a rather different problem. This image, what a lovely, lovely, civilized, beautifully managed farm this is, growing wheat in Narok, except for the fact that every drop of water used in that farm is stolen illegally from the local river and causes immense problems to downstream farmers, who have therefore been attacking the farm and damaging the water pumps and weirs. And this process of communities dividing against water extractors and attacking them is possibly the most common element of micro-conflict around water in Kenya. So those are our 3 field sites, all rather different. In each site, we've chosen 3 major case study areas where we've investigated in greater depth what has been going on. Isiolo, Burat, Ngaramare, and Cherab. And then in Narok, Narosoro, Mosiro, and Suswa. I don't have a slide for Marsabit because the team are there now and we're still collecting the data. So just to give an idea of how we model this and how we look at it, this is our sort of conflict dynamics graph. And essentially the things in red here are the things that are impacting upon the narrative. And as you can see, climate change is not among them because evidentially we find it difficult to evidentially show that climate change is the cause. So we've left off the dynamic. But when you speak to people, climate change is always the explanation. And these other things around the edge, the red marks, are often less commonly stated. And I would draw your attention to 2 or 3 things here. Firstly, that abstraction of water is critical. Secondly, that projects for irrigated agriculture invariably cause problems downstream, and that's a major source of conflict. And the move towards irrigated agriculture is, of course, a major reaction to climate change arguments, and it's been promoted by many international agencies as such. Firearms in this area, of course, are replete, easily available, munitions are easily available, so almost everyone is armed. And now in Isiolo, for example, local communities where boreholes are located have their own militia who are mounted on motorbikes and who can quickly move from one place to another to repel invaders. And of course, these militia are armed with Kalashnikovs and will not think twice about using them. And we, in fact, in the middle of our research a few months ago, came across a village that had been evacuated as a result of one such attack, and that was only 2 months ago. So firearms are a real issue here, and they provoke escalation. Lastly, on this slide, I'd also point out that mega projects are an issue. Kenya currently has a number of very large-scale projects, including the building of a new railway. These projects are often implemented without adequate environmental impact evaluation, and sometimes they have caused quite serious environmental problems. So, for example, the railway has caused major flooding in various areas because the culvert systems are not designed well enough to cope with increasing rainfall above the averages. Now, in Eastern Africa, you've got to remember as well, the impact of climate change is deeply complex. Many climatologists agree that East Africa is one of the most complex parts of the planet on which to predict the outcomes of climate change, because they are so varied and there are so many niche elements to it. So we see in East Africa quite significant flooding at the moment, as well as the prospect for the northern areas of Kenya of prolonged drought. And northern Kenya is currently in a prolonged drought. So the impact of mega projects becomes more difficult to define precisely. And I think designers have a challenge here in facing that. So Isiolo County, just a map to illustrate where we've been working. I would point out here, though, that the river that runs through the center of Isiolo, the Wasiniro, which is marked here on the map, rises out to the west in 2 different counties. And of course, this is part of the problem. As this slide illustrates, it's not land use change in Isiolo that is causing the problems of water supply on the Wasiniro. It's land use change in the headlands of that river, up in Laikipia and Nyandarua. And here this map illustrates the massive increase in human settlement in those areas. The population of Isiolo, by contrast, hasn't changed much in the last 30 years. But the population of Nyandarua and Laikipia has increased massively, and the level of cultivation in those areas has also increased massively. So this factor becomes important in Kenya, particularly because Kenya now has a devolved system of government, which means that individual counties look after their own policies. And therefore, for the county of Isiolo to persuade their neighbors in Nyandarua and Laikipia to do things that benefit them may be quite a struggle. Devolution may be a good thing in some ways. In this respect, it's not necessarily a good thing. Then going to Narok, our second case study area. Here, it's very important to notice that both the Mau and Loita water towers are situated in Narok district. Water tower systems are catchment areas which govern water supply into lowland areas. And in Narok, this is particularly important. And here, it's illustrated best of all on this time series map here, which shows the extent of land use change since 1990. And what I would draw your attention to here is simply just look at the pink. The pink are croplands. And you can see that this was largely a pastoral area in 1990, fringed by 2 large forests in the Mau and Loita. And now it is an area where there is cultivation almost everywhere. And if we mapped that in more detail for you, you would see that those cultivation areas that are emerging in previous pastoral lands follow the watercourses. Of course they do. How could they not? So water supply has suddenly become a major issue in Narok, a major issue. And here's the larger version of this map to illustrate it. So a pastoral land is now filled with farmers, and water has been in that process commodified. Most of these farmers are fencing what was previously pastoral land. We don't have figures for Narok on fencing, but for neighboring Kajiado, the figures suggest there's been a massive increase in fencing since 2005. And this leads to massive conflicts over access to what were previously considered common resources. And people are quite prepared to take the law into their own hands in dealing with this. They don't go to the police or the other authorities about it. However, when we turned up at one of the police stations in Narok, we were very much welcomed when they learned what we were researching, because at that place at Narosuru, the police there claimed that they had major problems with water conflicts. And they showed us their incident diary. Now, not every police station in Kenya keeps a very detailed incident diary, but these guys were rather good at it. And from that diary, we extracted these main events that occurred in the dry season between the end of 2019 and early 2020. And these are described by the local police there as major incidents that required them to bring help in from outside. And as you can see, there's 3 or 4 every month, and they are significant. Now, these are not, only one of these was actually an event where violence was committed at the event, but in almost every case, criminal damage was done, and the police say there is then retaliation. So this is causing a real escalation in local level violence that is quite palpable. And when you discuss this with people, everybody has tales to tell of water disputes of one kind or another. Now, to finish with, let me say a couple of things. You may recognize the 2 gentlemen in this slide, Kenya's current president and possibly the man who will soon be Kenya's president in the next election. Now, I'm not sure these 2 gentlemen do themselves individually do what Tim earlier on called implicatory denial, but there's a great deal of that going on among Kenya's politicians. Environmental resource conflicts in Kenya, we can demonstrate they're increasing markedly. We can demonstrate that their causes are complex and multi-layered. We can show you numerous examples of politicians blaming climate change and therefore excusing themselves from doing anything about it. And we can also show you numerous cases of local communities adopting exclusionary policies that lead to violence as a result of this. So, in conclusion, what might we say about this? Well, just 5 very brief points. Firstly, environmental scarcity theory does help us explain this, and I think is quite useful, and I'm sure Professor Homer Dixon will tell us more about that later on today. Local communities in Kenya are still in charge of their water committees. They still try and control their own supply, but these are weak, ineffective, and prone to capture by those with vested interests. And frankly, the legislation is inadequate, and recommendations we're making to the government in the project will be about trying to do things that strengthen that. But the increasing privatization of water, which is very much supported by Western donors to Kenya and the international community, is actually turning water into a commodity, not a common. And in a country like Kenya, that must invariably, and I think inevitably, lead to conflict, because not everyone is prepared to pay for their water. Government, of course, is the main agency in this, and I'm afraid the Kenyan government at the moment has inadequate legislation, weak implementation, a lack of control, and is, I think, undermined to a large extent by corrupt practices. I think all of these mean that the hypothesis that violence and violent conflict will increase is likely to be correct, because the Kenyan government will not be able to affect all of these things. We would also argue, my final point, that we've perhaps already passed a tipping point in terms of demographic pressure in these areas, and that accelerating land use change is already intensifying competition. And we may in fact be beyond the point where policies can change that, and we simply have to deal with its effects. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, David. That was really fascinating. It's really positive to see the level of granularity that's possible with the type of research that you're pursuing, and I think it usefully grounded some of the more abstract ideas that we were discussing in previous talks. For reasons of time, we'll proceed with haste to our 3rd speaker. Kimberly Marten is Professor of Political Science at Barnard College, Columbia University. Her current research focuses on Russia and the Arctic, and how Russia's mineral and gas industries are reacting to climate change concerns. Now, it's shocking o'clock in the morning for Kim, where she is, so we're especially grateful for her speaking to us on geopolitics and security in the changing Arctic. So, Kim, over to you. I think you're still muted, Kim.
Now am I unmuted?
That's right, we can hear you
And
now.
you can see my screen. Great,
Yeah, all
it's
good.
early. I apologize. My approach is a bit different from the previous two scholars. I'm going to try to give a sort of broad overview of the questions involved in geopolitics and security in the changing Arctic. And now I got to get it to forward. There we go. The Arctic is huge. It involves 8 different states, 5 of whom are considered coastal. So trying to say something that each of these have in common is a bit of a challenge, but I'm going to try to talk about some common problems that are facing this region because of climate change. There are a series of shared environmental shocks that are happening. And well, some of the previous speakers have been talking about gradual changes. What's interesting about the Arctic is how quickly these changes have been happening. And they are self-reinforcing because each of the changes that happens in turn is causing more climate change to happen. So the first is diminishing Arctic sea ice, which we've heard a lot about. As the sea ice diminishes, it means that it is reflecting less sunlight out back, and that means that it itself is contributing to warming and all of the things that are associated with warming seawaters and changing currents. Then we have thawing permafrost, and we are learning as time goes on that in addition to the dangers of the thawing permafrost itself for buildings and for infrastructure, it is releasing methane deposits, and the methane deposit release is in turn accelerating climate change problems. And then finally, we have increasing forest fires in the northern forests. And of course, when you have forest fires, you also have an increased release of smoke, which in turn is releasing more carbon into the atmosphere. And so these 3 problems together help to explain why climate change in the Arctic is accelerating at a much faster rate than climate change elsewhere in the world, somewhere between 2.5 and 3 times faster than what we're seeing climate change in other places. And what is really, when we're talking about the geopolitics of the area, what is bringing these geopolitical concerns together are the new geopolitical ambitions of authoritarian states in the region that have been allowed to come forward because of the climate change that's happening with the melting sea ice. And the key to everything is Russia's increasingly ice-free Northern Sea route. We have already had a situation where there has been an ice-free period over the summer, this past summer, and the expectation is that the sea ice will be decreasing at a rapidly expanding space in the future. There will still be dangers that involve the need to use icebreakers, but the sea route is becoming much more open, much more quickly than anybody had anticipated. In addition to what this mean for this might mean for Russia's ambitions, what we see is China's use or potential use of this as part of its Belt and Road Initiative. It's been called the Polar Silk Road or the Ice Silk Road. We'll see in a moment that there's some level of conflict and tension that remains between Russia and China, but certainly in the popular press, what we've seen is a belief that somehow Russia and China are going to be cooperating together to completely change geopolitics through using this increasingly ice-free Northern Sea route for both commercial and military purposes. So now let's look at some common political themes across the melting Arctic that I will try to give some examples of for each case. The first is that in spite of this belief that things are changing so rapidly and it's more like a wild new frontier that we haven't experienced before, the truth is that each of the members of the Arctic have shared interests in upholding state sovereignty and the international legal order. And I would argue that that is a limit on the level of conflict that is likely to emerge. The second thing that we need to keep in mind is investment uncertainty from possible stranded assets. As the global concern is increasing about meeting net zero expectations by 2050, some of the things that Russia is planning for its Northern Sea route may not actually come to fruition because of a lack of investment support for them. And then finally, we also see changing power dynamics for the indigenous peoples in the region that work in different directions depending on the circumstances that we're talking about. So now I'll go through each of these in a little bit more depth. So in terms of the upholding of state sovereignty, the Arctic is completely governed by state-based international law. And all Arctic states continue to benefit from upholding that international law because it gives them some control over what is happening in the regions along their coastlines and in the surrounding areas. And let me just give you 2 examples of what this has meant. We heard a lot in the press in 2007 about this Arctic expedition that was coming from Russia, where a submersible went and planted a Russian flag on contested territory that was right at the North Pole. And it appeared that Russia was now claiming that this territory was its own and that this was what was happening. And there was just an immense amount of concern in the popular press that Putin was trying to make this an expansionist move and that this was dangerous for the future of Arctic politics because Canada and Denmark have contrasting claims to this area. But what we've seen in reality is that the Arctic 5 coastal states reacted to this, including Russia, by getting together and issuing a declaration, the Ilulissat Declaration of 2008, in which they reaffirmed the principles of the law of the sea and the principles of resolving these kinds of conflicts through legal mechanisms rather than through conflictual military mechanisms. And what we've seen since then is that there has been a repeated movement of Russia to present new evidence before the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, again, making claims that are expansive about which territory on the seabed belongs to Russia, but it's being done through legal frameworks, through the use of scientific evidence. And what we have not seen is that it's leading to military conflicts. And the argument here is that it is in Russia's interest, just as it is in the interests of Canada and Denmark and all of the other countries involved, to use legal mechanisms so that they maintain control over their areas and so that this doesn't become an area of conflict unnecessarily. Another area where we've seen this happen is in fishing rights. And here we've seen it involving both the Arctic 5 coastal states, and also 5 other states, including China and including states from the European Union. And the question was over fishing rights that have not yet become possible because it's happening under areas that are still covered by ice in the central Arctic, in open waters. But after some debate, what was reached was an international agreement to ensure that there would not be a problem of the commons in the central Arctic Ocean going forward, when we know that demand for fish around the world is going to be increasing, and therefore the temptation to participate in unregulated fishing is going to be there. So once again, we have these states saying that it's in their interests to return to sovereign law to try to control what's happening to prevent problems from happening. And I think that altogether, this gives us some sense that conflict is not going to be immense over these kinds of issues, at least in the near future. I want to further argue that this may limit China's ambitions in the Arctic. China is not an Arctic state, but in recent years, it's been calling itself a near Arctic state. China has been pushing towards having a separate legal regime for the Arctic that would be different from the standard law of the sea regime. And it has tried to call the Arctic a region of global concern rather than of concern to only the Arctic states. And what's happening in each of these cases is that the Arctic states have been pushing back against China's claims. So just 2 examples that have been in the news. In 2011, a Chinese businessman tried to buy a large tract of territory in Iceland, saying that it was for private hotel developments and resort developments. Certainly, Iceland has a lot of trade relationships with China. There was a lot of political discussion within Iceland about what this would mean. But in the end, the Icelandic government pushed back and said, we are concerned that this might become dual use property, that this would be used for conflictual military purposes, and we're not interested in it. And in the end, someone from the UK ended up working out the arrangement with local landowners to build a resort of some sort in this area. And a second example has been the use of Chinese research icebreakers along the Russian coast. We've seen an increase in their use in recent years, but we have to remember that up until the Ukraine conflict in particular, Russia was really preventing China from using those icebreakers to come into its territories, exerting its sovereign right to say that it had control over those waters and what was being done in terms of the environmental impact of the Chinese icebreakers. And even though we have seen Russia being much more willing in recent years to allow China to use the Northern Sea route much more frequently, China has not forgotten this level of conflict, and it is a level of tension in the relationship that is going to have to be resolved going forward. Then let's turn to the risk of stranded assets. The term was coined by Carbon Tracker and the London School of Economics in 2013. It simply means that political action, so for example, through the Net Zero 2050 movement, will limit future petroleum demand because investment firms are going to find public pressure not to invest in petroleum in particular going forward, and that this is going to cause huge investment risks. And this is something that matters in Arctic offshore oil and gas development for 3 states in particular, the US and Alaska, for Norway and for Russia. And we've seen in both the United States and Norway a variety of political conflicts over what this should mean going forward and how much petroleum development should be continuing. But I want to concentrate on Russia in particular and argue that even beyond petroleum concerns, even beyond oil and gas, it may eventually limit Putin's grand Arctic infrastructure plans. This has been a sort of a showpiece of what Putin has been putting forward of Russian plans. It's part of the Northern Sea Route expansion. It involves both liquid natural gas coming from Novatek and Gazprom, a private company and a state company. It involves a huge oil development by the Rosneft state-controlled oil company that would involve building 15 new company towns in addition to all of the other work that goes into new oil developments. He's even talking about a new coal port and a new coal mine. What is really interesting about this is that the first investors pulled out because they thought it wouldn't be something that was actually profitable. And so now he's pushing others to come in and take these contracts for a new coal port and coal mine, even though international projections believe that by 2025, coal demand will have plateaued globally. It involves a new railway on virgin tundra. And when you put all of this together, it looks like this huge new development that's taking advantage of climate change, but the general assessment is that it may not be profitable. Even the Northern Sea Route may need state subsidization. It would incredibly decrease the time that it would take China to send goods to Europe, and so that would decrease the costs in that sense. But it's going to remain with navigational difficulties going forward. Permafrost problems may cause the ports themselves to have problems with land decay, and it may not be possible to have even a firm idea of what the Northern Sea Route looks like. And so it's going to have to be subsidized to make it comparable either to the Suez Canal or to railways for getting Chinese goods to Europe. So the question is, why is he doing it? It may be that state subsidy money and contract money is actually going to Putin's cronies. It's not going to Russian state interests, but to the private interests surrounding the Kremlin. And it may also be that Putin as an individual truly believes in state planning and truly believes that Russia's identity depends on what's happening in the Arctic. And so he may push it forward, even if it doesn't lead to more money coming in, just because he sees it as something that helps stabilize his time in office and stabilize his rule by giving the Russian people something to feel excited about going forward. And then finally, let me just say a few words about the changing power dynamics for Arctic indigenous peoples. We've all heard about the security threats that involve the indigenous peoples in the Arctic. The permafrost melt is damaging villages. It's causing entire areas to have to be relocated, for example, in Alaska. It's causing changes in animal-fish migration patterns, which is leading to declines in traditional hunting and fishing possibilities. And for one example in Russia, and this is for the liquid natural gas development happening on the Yamal Peninsula, it's really causing a decline in the political power of the indigenous people because they're being pushed off their traditional territory with no real way of answering this in Russia. We see Novatek, this private company, as coming to the forefront in what's happening in Russia. But it's also leading to empowerment in some areas. The most recent clear example we have of that is in Greenland, which has a majority indigenous population. And what we've seen is that in 2021, electoral victory of the Inuit, explicitly Inuit party, has led to a real break on uranium and rare earth mine plans in a particular area that is environmentally fragile, which has put the kibosh on Australian plans that were in turn backed by a Chinese firm to build rare earth minerals that would involve uranium mining as well. And so we've seen that, in fact, there can be an empowerment of indigenous people as well as a lack of empowerment. And even in Russia, in 2020, after the huge environmental disaster that we saw at the Norilsk nickel plant, you may all have heard in the press about how this turned a major Arctic river bright red and probably made it out to the Arctic Ocean. It's considered the biggest environmental disaster ever to happen in the Arctic. After that happened, the local indigenous population sent an open letter to Elon Musk of Tesla saying, don't buy the nickel from Norilsk nickel for the batteries that you're putting in your electric vehicles because they're a dirty company. And what we saw in response is that Norilsk nickel actually reached out in a brand new way to the indigenous population and is now at least paying them off and perhaps including them in their plans in a way that didn't happen beforehand. So in all cases, we shouldn't make assumptions about the direction that the power dynamics are going. So in sum, the West should be very wary of Russia and China's new geopolitical ambitions in the Arctic. Without question, things are changing very rapidly, and it's something to really keep an eye on. But we should also be careful not to buy the hype of autocrats. An awful lot of what is happening here is speech rather than actuality. It may not have enough funding to actually come into practice because of the difficulties that remain in these Arctic investments and because of the problem of stranded assets, of investments that are going to be in not very long in the future, no longer able to return anything to the people who are making the investments because the world politically will turn away from the use of oil and gas. Sovereignty, stranded assets, uncertainty, and shifting indigenous power dynamics may all serve as limits on these geopolitical ambitions. And so my closing thought is that rather than concentrating so much on these geopolitical ambitions and their dangers, we might be concentrating more on the real physical damages that are associated with climate change in the Arctic. And I would argue that those are not yet limited by politics. And it's time that we start turning politics in the direction of limiting them. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kim. Wonderful. You wrapped your arms around an enormous body of material there. Incredibly impressive. It did dawn on me that your insights were very kind of strategic in nature. Dave's insights were very kind of tactical in nature. And of course, both are absolutely crucial to the military and security enterprises. So, you know, the different levels of analysis are incredibly helpful and fruitful. Okay, so right to our final speaker in the panel. Dr. Richard Milburn is a member of the Environmental Security Research Group at King's College London, and he's also an Army reservist. He's provided expertise to support the British Army's counter-illegal wildlife trafficking work. That's a mouthful. His PhD at KCL involved fieldwork in the Democratic Republic of Congo and explored the links between wildlife conservation, peace building, and development. So Richard, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. So yeah, sort of slightly double hatting today, both the King's College London side and also the Army Reservist side, so hopefully give a bit of an academic and a practitioner overview in one. But as with all these things, any thoughts shared on my own and aren't representative of either institution. So yeah, I'll just start with a bit of an overview of the illegal wildlife trade before getting directly onto the climate change stuff. So an estimated $9 to $23 billion annual illicit trade. And the crucial thing really is that it's involving serious organized crime. So there is that real security threat in terms of that serious organized crime. There have been links to terrorist and insurgents organizations, but the credibility of those is disputable. And then there's also the loss of habitat. So both the loss of wildlife that play the role of actually maintaining key ecosystems and carbon sinks, and also just the loss of habitat that can then contribute to climate change if we're not protecting the parks and the ecosystems within which those wildlife sit. From a military perspective, so we really try and look at it as a low intensity counterinsurgency environment. So we take a national park is usually quite some distance away from central government authority. So you have the park and the human population surrounding it. So we can actually view that almost as a state within a state and then apply our counterinsurgency doctrine in a low intensity, primarily non-kinetic environment to address it. At the tactical level, you're really looking at what we use poacher's equation. It's more of a framework than an equation. So what have people got to gain from poaching and involvement in the illegal wildlife trade? Is it revenue from, they don't have a job, so this is a source of revenue? Is it revenge against the park or against wildlife? And then also, what's their potential loss? Have they already got a job? Have they got a way to feed their family, send their kids to school? Or actually, have they got nothing, in which case they're more likely to poach? And also, what will happen if they're arrested? What's the criminal prosecution? And then all of that combined with the risk of getting caught. So even if there's a big loss, if people don't think they're going to get caught, then actually they're more likely to engage in that poaching activity. That framework then also drives how we should be responding to the threat. So addressing all those three elements. Then at the strategic level, it's fundamentally about economics. So killing wildlife is low cost. Hand somebody $10 and a rifle, they'll go out and get you a rhino horn, elephant ivory, pangolin, etc. And it's highly lucrative. We've seen $9 to $23 billion. In contrast, conservation is very high cost. You've got to have rangers everywhere all the time and massively under-resourced. So the actual global economic system is just driving this continually. The thing to stress there that I really, really do try and stress both within mod and outside is a very challenging problem, but it is actually solvable. And what we've seen, and we'll come on to, this is actually a solvable problem that can then support the fight against climate change as well. So then a quick bit of background about what the Army is actually doing. So quite a few people aren't aware of what corded, even people I speak to within the British Army aren't aware that it's going on. So originally it started out just providing tracking training to rangers. So trying to deliver very basic infantry skills, particularly around tracking, to enhance ranger capability. It's an 11 brigade owned task, an op. So they actually were seeking out more expertise to better understand the problem and see how corded could evolve to deliver more. There was a sort of appetite thinking there could be more that the Army could deliver. So they brought in myself and a couple of others to provide that civilian expertise. So we really, again, always try to put it in military terms. So we've adapted the Q1 analytical process through SWIPRO, which is the Strategic Wildlife Protection Framework, something I developed at King's and then just moved across into that sort of Q1 framework, but with some things taken out and some things added in to make it relevant to countering the illegal wildlife trade. We've also developed a CDAC course, which is Conservation Data Analysis course. So it's using the principles of military intelligence to enable national park authorities and rangers to predict where poaching is likely to happen and deploy resources, concentrated resources into those locations to better effect arrests and also to improve ranger safety. So that's on top of the conventional infantry stuff. And actually that sort of G2 capability is a major capability multiplier. So when you have very, very few resources in a park, actually, it's so important that they are directed, and virtually no one in the world is actually currently using proper intelligence, proactive intelligence-led counter-poaching. Most of it's reactive from human tip-offs or a bit of historical data analysis. What we're able to do is actually predict and also develop the capacity to understand the problem within the human terrain and then work with park authorities to address the root causes. So you get rid of 80 to 90% of poaching, which is primarily driven by poverty. And then you use a G2-led well-trained ranger force to address the criminal elements left over. And then as a result of that, sort of combining all the academic and practitioner stuff in civilian life into the military stuff, we've come up with this strategy, so a four-pronged strategy that works both where we're operating now in Zambia, but is actually a global solution and an overall strategy that can be applied to probably 90–95% of locations around the world. At the moment, Corded is only really focusing in on that number one, disrupt the poacher. It's very much a tactical level counter the poacher operation, but we're trying to actually expand that out to truly address the underlying causes. So just looking specifically, how does it link into climate change and risks and opportunities? So the risks really are quite minimal. They're the standard sort of things as heat changes we've heard earlier from General Nuji and others, about the risk to our capabilities from a changing climate and the changing environment we'll have to operate in. Corded is a tiny operation, so there is likely to be some risks associated with climate change, but not massive, and probably forest fires would be the biggest consideration because you are out in the hulu, so that risk of fire is quite significant. But the opportunities are really the big focus. So one of the big things that I've been pushing for about 10 years, my PhD research went on that military operations don't actually necessarily have to be negative impact on the environment. they can actually have a positive impact, and environmental considerations can be better integrated into operational planning to have a positive effect. And we've been hearing earlier, for a lot of people around the world, the natural resource base is mission critical for their lives. So if we're not protecting that, we're actually undermining the capability and the resilience for post-war recovery. So we should be integrating those considerations in any way. And actually this increased understanding around climate change, I think, is starting to drive that more effectively, which is really positive and really important thing. Also help to achieve net zero. It's highly likely that we will not be able to get down to zero emissions by 2050, certainly with UK mod and our legally mandated requirement to be net zero as UK government, and mod contributing 50% of emissions to that. So actually, by deploying on these sorts of operations and protecting and restoring the natural environment, that can help us absorb some of those excess emissions. And as has been spoken about earlier, this desire to actually increase the carbon capture capacity of the earth to buy us more time to get that technological change. So actually these operations can be part of that. Where we are at the moment in Kafue National Park, it's the size of Wales. These natural areas, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, are absolutely huge, some of these national parks and forest systems. So if you can actually actively protect and restore where they've been degraded, there's a massive carbon capacity, and it's a very low cost and efficient way to achieve that. Also a big opportunity to test and innovate equipment and our own TTPs. So again, look at this as a coin environment, actually to do all the non-kinetic aspects of coin really well and much better. How do we understand the human terrain in a different culture? How do we deploy into it and effectively address that, not solely relying on kinetic action, which you're usually very good at, but actually doing all those things that militaries tend to not be as strong at, and particularly developing that CIMIC capability. And then all of that fits into, as we've seen, the likely increase in either counterinsurgency or intra state conflicts, community conflicts. Actually, we can develop the capability to address them. And then that really feeds into where I'll finish off, trying to blitz through this fairly quickly to keep time open for questions. So Corded at the moment is a very, very good operation. Militaries have the capabilities and specific skill sets that no one else does in the world that can have a major impact on improving the effort to counter the illegal wildlife trade, both in terms of our counterinsurgency capability, infantry skills capability, medical capability, but also crucially our G2 capability to be able to predict what's going to happen and effectively address that, and be able to deploy resources in advance to address problems. Can take a small team and make them incredibly effective, which you just simply can't do without that G2 role. However, it's still not fully there. We're still not completely addressing the root causes of the illegal wildlife trade through the op. And we're doing it on a very small scale. So I just wanted to set out here actually what the sort of gold standard would be and how that could fit positively for wider operations. So the ideal is you would have a small team of committed people, a combination of reservists and regulars and civilian experts, but crucially committed for 5 years. You can't just have this turnover. Somebody comes in for 2 years or 6 months and goes away. It just destroys the capability. You need a long-term strategy. And this is something that's been talked about a lot more widely among militaries anyway, but this is a good opportunity to actually demonstrate how a 5-year commitment can be beneficial. We're not going to solve the problem on a global scale as a military, nor should we. It's not really our job. However, what we can do is deliver proof of concept in 2 to 3 parks, use this as a catalyst for wider change. We can show the bespoke gold standard solution, we can show what works, and then teach others, whether they be donors, whether they be NGOs, whether they be commercial organizations, actually how to do this, and then roll it out on the back of that. Continue to deliver the G2 Ranger training to develop capability. They have a significant positive impact and a major capability multiplier. So we continue to do that. But crucially, what's needed is a CIMIC team to address the underlying problem. As I said, you can get rid of 80 to 90% of poaching by delivering interventions in the human terrain. If we're not addressing the human terrain, we're not fully addressing that problem. So developing that CIMIC capability, understanding that counterinsurgency approach, address the root causes, which is in our counterinsurgency doctrine, but seems to often be ignored. And also then engaging with other government departments, and crucially the private sector, and having those capabilities that we're maintaining, even when we're not in an Afghan or other major conflict, we're still actually maintaining those relationships, and we can roll through soldiers and commanders who can learn on this up and then move on to future conflicts. And then really trying to make this a petri dish and an innovation space so that to teach, test and innovate equipment and approaches. So, if there is new equipment that's being brought in, this is a great chance to use it. There's a relatively low risk to life for soldiers on operation. The primary risk is actually from wildlife, not from people, and is manageable. So, it's a much more permissive environment to be running an op than any sort of conventional counterinsurgency would be. So there's a great opportunity to do that. And that tip of the sustainability spear, it's not just what we're doing, but it's also what are we eating? What are we eating with? What water are we consuming? How are we consuming it? The best approach accordingly would actually be it becomes the gold standard for sustainability. So no bottled water, for example, purely filtered water, things like that, and how we do that. And then, the fundamental thing is it is that microcosm to develop best practice coin capability, particularly the non-kinetic elements of that. And I've been saying for a few years to people, there's quite a lot of skepticism, or there was, about why is the army involved in an operation like this? Irrelevant, it's just a PR exercise, etc. But actually, by understanding that coin environment, we realize if we can't properly solve the illegal wildlife trade in a park, we're never going to solve a real difficult, challenging, massive problem like Afghanistan. And actually, a lot of the failings I've been hearing about and lessons learned from Afghanistan, you can see coming across into the illegal wildlife trade space. And we've already got solutions to them in that space. Actually, if we can deliver them, we learn the lessons, we learn the approaches that can then be applied on a wider scale. And then we're also protecting and restoring nature and those key carbon sinks to increase that absorptive carbon absorptive capacity against climate change. So I'll stop there.